Thanks to our title sponsor, ExtraHop, for making Research Saturday possible. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CyberWire's Research Saturday. I'm Dave Bittner, and this is our weekly conversation with researchers and analysts tracking down threats and vulnerabilities, solving some of the hard problems of protecting ourselves in a rapidly evolving cyberspace. Thanks for joining us.
Manufacturing in general is an interesting target for adversaries, and certainly, ransomware being a big one.
That's Selena Larson. She's a senior cyber threat analyst at Dragos. Dragos recently released their first cyber threat perspective on the manufacturing industry, and that's the research we're discussing today. And now, a word from our sponsor, ExtraHop, securing modern business with cloud-native network detection and response. The massive shift to remote work has turned the reality of work on its head. With cloud and multi-cloud adoption, comprehensive visibility is more important than ever. But in order to protect your business, you need more than unified visibility. You need intelligence response workflows so teams can collaborate easily and act quickly. Thanks also to our sponsor, Verizon, who for nearly 2 decades has helped secure data, networks, and infrastructure of many of the world's best-known organizations. Their annual data breach investigations report is considered the gold standard of cybercrime research, and Verizon's leadership in network, wireless, and IoT connectivity makes it uniquely capable of protecting the ever-expanding attack surface. Let Verizon help you optimize your defenses and achieve the maximum return on your security investments. Learn more at verizonenterprise.com/products/security.
There is increasing interest from a variety of different adversaries targeting this sector. And so what we found is the cyber risk to the manufacturing sector is increasing. You have cyber attacks that are impacting industrial processes, intrusions that are enabling sort of information gathering, IP theft, as well as new activity from ICS-targeting adversaries.
Can you give us a little bit of lay of the land in terms of when we're talking about manufacturing, what's the spectrum of things that term covers?
So that's a great question, right? So manufacturing on its own is a pretty large umbrella. And for me, it's personally, it's very interesting because when we think of industrial control systems and critical infrastructure, a lot of us kind of think of the lights, right? Electricity, the lights are on, driving our cars, oil and gas, that type of thing. But manufacturing is kind of the underpinning of all of the global supply chains, and everything that we touch and interact with and work with, et cetera, has been touched in some way by a manufacturing process. So that can be anything from food and beverage to pharmaceutical to the defense industrial base, for instance, right? You have a lot of different types of manufacturing under this sort of umbrella. And it's oftentimes kind of difficult to be able to sort of classify, the cyber risk or cyber threats to the manufacturing sector as a whole, because there are different sort of requirements in place when it comes to cybersecurity or information security in these sort of different subsectors. However, as a whole, a lot of the processes are very similar, right? They very much rely on just-in-time manufacturing. They rely on process automation. So the databases where information is stored will interact with, the enterprise side for keeping track of things like ingredients or, supply chain management, information required for FDA regulation, that type of thing. So in a lot of ways, the processes and automation in place in manufacturing is across the board very similar, despite the industries being very different.
So what makes them a target? What are the things that are attractive to the folks who are out there looking to do them harm or penetrate their defenses?
Sure. So ransomware is definitely something that is very, very heavily targeting manufacturing. We actually identified that throughout 2020, the number of publicly reported ransomware attacks on manufacturing entities has more than tripled compared to last year. And I do want to point out here that's confirmed. Oftentimes you'll see on leak sites that there are companies that are named, but unable to sort of confirm them. But this number is increasing. It's very interesting to ransomware adversaries because they're conducting this sort of big game hunting operations and have learned that uptime, especially when it comes to manufacturing, maintaining that sort of just-in-time processes, that automation is very important for manufacturing companies. And even if it doesn't necessarily impact the OT or ICS side of the house, you do have disruptions to potentially sales, order fulfillment, logistics, these kind of very important sort of supply chain management applications that enable and sort of support the OT ICS functions. And so we're also seeing that ICS adversaries are adopting the sort of ICS-aware, ICS-specific mechanisms in their code where they are targeting industrial processes and are able to sort of kill or otherwise stop ICS-specific processes, much like they do in more sort of IT side of the house. So it is very interesting that we are seeing more ransomware adversaries kind of adopting this more targeted approach to industrial control systems, and certainly manufacturing is a part of that.
Now, in the report, you all have you're tracking 5 of the active groups who are targeting manufacturing. Who's our rogues gallery here?
So we have 5 publicly reported groups: CHRYSENE, MAGNALLIUM, PARISITE, WASSONITE, and XENOTIME. But XENOTIME is arguably, we consider them to be the most dangerous and most capable. XENOTIME has targeted original equipment manufacturers, for instance, but they've also targeted electric and oil and gas companies. And what's unique about this group is that actually has demonstrated the ability to develop malware specifically targeting ICS processes. So that's with CHRYSENE, right? It's specifically targeted a safety instrumented system and an oil and gas facility. That's concerning because, when you're talking from a manufacturing perspective, Stuxnet actually targeted uranium enrichment, right? Like, okay, drink Stuxnet, but this is probably the most well known, and it targeted these sort of PLCs that were controlling the centrifuges used in uranium enrichment. And so, we do have examples of adversaries being capable of interacting with and potentially disrupting manufacturing. But what we've seen more recently is that the safety instrumented system, and then crash override, which was electric focused. But, we haven't observed, either CHRYSENE or crash override disrupting manufacturing operations, but it is possible that adversaries that are working on developing ICS-specific malware might target manufacturing companies in the process of developing this malware, even if they're not necessarily the ultimate target.
Are they showing restraint? In other words, there's a difference between shutting down an assembly line and affecting something that could possibly lead to loss of life. Is there any nuance there?
There's certainly nuance. I would say that the activity that we are seeing when it comes to manufacturing is largely focused on things like ransomware, IP theft. Not necessarily targeting, the equipment that could be, that is used for maintaining safe, reliable, healthy processes, both for people and the environment. I don't know if it's necessarily, I don't want to ascribe, goals or objectives or desires to adversaries, right? But what we've seen so far, based on the threat data, we're seeing adversaries that are interested in potentially disrupting process for ransomware opportunities, but also potentially targeting manufacturing for data theft, reconnaissance. Largely, we've seen evidence of them targeting pharmaceutical companies, for instance, research and development organizations that are involved in COVID, coronavirus vaccine. So, these are kind of the big threats, I would say, right now, currently, to this sector. And to be clear, too, there are very serious consequences to ransomware that is able to disrupt processes. Whether or not, the safety system is going to be impacted, we're not seeing that, right? But we are seeing people's lives disrupted in other ways. We've seen ransomware cause layoffs in steel manufacturing, for instance. Employees had to go home for days and sometimes weeks as a result of ransomware that disrupted operations. So, they're losing their livelihoods because of this. Although we didn't specifically focus on this in our research, either in manufacturing or some of my research I've been doing in ransomware, healthcare is another huge one. This is something that is impacting people in ways that we haven't necessarily seen before, right? These adversaries coming at very, very vital, critical infrastructure and causing disruptive effects. So there are, a lot of consequences for this type of activity, whether it's economic, whether it's personal, whether it's emotional, frankly, that I think oftentimes we don't really think about these sort of domino-like repercussions, whether it's, ransomware, for instance, or IP theft, these types of things that have impact to the supply chain beyond just the target.
Do we see organizations sort of, firing shots across the bow of saying, demonstrating their capabilities, saying, we could do this if we chose to. It's an awfully nice factory you've got there. Be a shame if anything were to happen to it.
Not that I have observed. That isn't necessarily something that we have visibility into.
Gotcha. Now, you talk about how so many manufacturing facilities, they're relying on, just-in-time processes. Is that by its very nature? Does that make them a little more fragile? That it's easy for things to sort of cascade through the system if one particular system goes down?
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's kind of funny to think about, right? So a lot of times we'll think about disruption to the sort of just-in-time process or the process automation on a production floor, right? The factory floor, and the sort of robot arm getting a little bit broken, and then the like in that I Love Lucy clip where she's working on the chocolate line and she just has to shove all the chocolate into her shirt. It's like, oh no, the process is disrupted. But beyond that, you have, for instance, the trucks and the drivers that are relying on picking up and driving, whatever it is that is being manufactured, right? So they go to the plant, they're waiting there, they have a set time that they're going to be getting, they're picking up the shipments of whatever the textile or food or whatever it is, and then they're going to be, driving it to their destination that has a set time of receipt. And that destination is going to be planning their own distribution or sales or, their own manufacturing based off of this timetable that the driver is operating on. But if something is disrupted in the sort of early in that whole manufacturing line, if the trucks can't get their deliveries on time, then you're going to have a huge traffic jam of trucks. And then So it's not just going to be, this one individual that's impacted. It's going to be every person that is on shift that day that is going to have to, have disruption to their timetables. And then the customers down the line is going to be disrupted. So there's actually an interesting story that I like to cite. Earlier this year, there was a software provider of auction software for the wool industry in Australia and New Zealand. This it was essentially a platform that was used for doing business for the farmers and textile and wool vendors, and essentially they just used a software called Talman. So Talman suffered a ransomware attack and essentially disrupted wool buying and selling across the entire continent of Australia and throughout New Zealand as well. And there was actually some local reports that said it essentially prevented 44,000 bales of wool worth up to $70 million from entering the marketplace. So this attack in February, disrupted the auction process, which in turn had impacts on, the farmers themselves, as well as the buyers and sellers of the wool, but also, the textile mills that are going to be receiving that wool, that are expecting to get it and, work it into their own manufacturing, whether, making sweaters or whatnot. And,
Right.
and that's in different countries, whether that's China or Italy or, the other recipients of Australian wool. So you have this sort of domino effect that's like, even in the IT software that supports auctioning of this product, you have this ripple effect through industrial processes that are reliant on the, manufacturing and distribution and, farming and agriculture that surrounds this entire industry. So one disruption can have these sort of huge ripple effects.
Yeah, and I suppose, wool is interesting in itself, but imagine if it's something perishable, like, bananas or tomatoes or, something that has a limited amount of time that it can sit around.
Well, we actually have seen that, right? We've seen ransomware impact meat. The manufacturer of meat in New Zealand, AFCO, I believe it was. Also, that's another example of a ransomware attack kind of disrupting the manufacturing processes. And certainly, meat is something that's very perishable. That's also something that, people are, go to the grocery store and expect to see it. And if it's not there, it again has a sort of human impacts. Granted, meat isn't something that's, life or death, but it is kind of annoying.
Yeah, but I think that's an important point that's often overlooked, as you point out. If you go to your local market and there's no meat there, there's an emotional component to that where you think, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, there's that sort of frustration, and it kind of from the perspective of a company too, right? Like if something impacts your company or your brand, there's a mistrust or frustration with the company, right? So customers will feel frustrated, and so that's something also too to sort of take into consideration from an asset owner and operator perspective is that we are protecting the integrity of our manufacturing, but as well as our business and our reputation. And so, when you're sort of conducting these sort of risk analysis, and when we're talking about, the cyber risk to manufacturing, you kind of include all of these additional factors and the sort of impacts to, like we kind of said earlier, impacts across the board from economics to personal frustrations.
So what are your recommendations? In terms of that risk analysis, in terms of planning for these things that, I don't know if it's fair to say they're eventualities, but, it's the stories keep coming every day. What sort of things should organizations be doing to better protect themselves?
Mm-hmm. So conducting crown jewel analysis is very, very important. Essentially having asset owners and operators identify what are the crown jewels in my operations environment and what are the consequences that could occur if they were compromised, disrupted, etc. So, safety systems are very, very important, and that might be considered a crown jewel in many cases. A crown jewel might be, a very specific pharmaceutical component or something like this, like a trade secret that you need to protect. So to kind of identify what these crown jewels are, conducting this sort of crown jewel analysis, and then establishing your security operations to kind of build around that assessment. Another thing that we often see in manufacturing specifically is very flat networks. You might see OT and IT being on the same network, for instance, or not having jump box, pretty weak firewall rules, very sort of flat networks. Certainly restricting access and conducting those architecture reviews to sort of identify the assets, connections, and communications between IT and OT, and not just we're talking asset identification. That's something that I think asset owners can do a much better job of. But we're not just talking about like, okay, this X number of HMIs, PLCs, etc. But what ports are open? What are restricted? What are they talking to? Who are they talking to? What devices and communications are going outbound from OT and what are going inbound? Our ERP software, do we have is that, talking to only the required assets, or is that something that, has additional access to different workstations in this environment? Who has access to the workstations or the PLCs, the controllers, et cetera? So knowing not just what's on your network, but who and what it's talking to and who and what has access to it is very, very important. And then certainly too, like supply chain and identifying the sort of third-party operators, identifying sort of reliance on the software and services that are directly in your environment, and again, the connections to and from the type of access this equipment or the people monitoring it has. Again, that is super important. So we provided a bunch of defensive recommendations in the threat perspective that we strongly encourage folks to read, because it is very difficult to kind of give a one-size-fits-all answer. So we really did try to come up with some that are across the board, good advice specifically for manufacturing, and to sort of lower the cyber risk to your organization.
Our thanks to Selena Larson from Dragos for joining us. The research is Dragos' cyber threat perspective on the manufacturing industry. You can find more on their website. Thanks to ExtraHop for sponsoring our show. You can learn more at extrahop.com/cyber or connect with them on Twitter or Facebook. Our thanks to Verizon for sponsoring our show. You can learn more at verizonenterprise.com/products/security. The CyberWire Research Saturday is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Our amazing CyberWire team is Elliot Peltzman, Puru Prakash, Stefan Vaziri, Kelsey Bond, Tim Nodar, Joe Kerrigan, Carol Terrio, Ben Yellen, Nick Valecki, Gina Johnson, Bennett Moe, Chris Russell, John Petrick, Jennifer Iben, Rick Howard, Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.